Okay. All righty, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, good afternoon, depending on what part of the world that you're at. Welcome to tonight's conversation with Christof Spieler, and happy Transit Month to you and yours. My name is Dave Sorrell, and I'm a board member here with Seamless Bay Area in the East Bay. Seamless was founded in 2018 with the goal of transitioning and transforming the Bay Area's fragmented and rather inconvenient transit system into one integrated, accessible, and rider-friendly network. We are proud to be a lead partner in putting on our region's Transit Month celebration, which is happening right now. But throughout the month of September, community members are coming together to celebrate the vital role of what public transit means for our communities and to ask our elected officials and leaders to make transit a priority issue, and especially this year, encouraging people to get back on transit. During the celebration, we couldn't think of anyone better to speak about the importance of a connected, rider-friendly transit system, whether it be in the Bay Area or beyond, than Christof Spieler, who we are very proud to have with us for this conversation. Christof is the Vice President and Director of Planning at Hoyt-Zollers and a senior lecturer at Rice University. He is the author of The Trains, Buses, People, an opinionated atlas of U.S. transit, which has just been released in a fully updated second edition by Island Press. Spieler has spent over a decade advocating for transit as a writer, community leader, urban planner, transit board member, and enthusiast. He strongly believes that just about anyone, regardless of training or experience, can identify what makes good transit with the right information. Tonight, Christof will be speaking with us about the second edition of Trains, Buses, People, and the high-functioning transit systems across North America and what lessons they could be able to hold for us here in the Bay Area. After his presentation, he will join Seamless Policy Director Ian Griffiths for a Q&A about the book and other topics of interest. Later, our advocacy director, Adina Levin, will highlight a few upcoming advocacy opportunities related to some of the topics that Christof will cover in his book. And lastly, we'll give you more information on how you can be able to buy Christof's book. By the way, we are also recording this event and sharing the recording with everyone who RSVP'd, just in case that you've missed it today, or if you want to be able to reference back. With further ado, I am proud to announce and welcome Christof Spieler.
Excellent. I am very happy to be here and talking to Seamless again and talking virtually in the Bay Area, which is actually where I grew up. I grew up in Pinole, California at a point when it was served by 3 different fixed route bus operators, all of whom had different fare systems and all of whom had different schedules. And that made a real impact on how I've thought about transit ever since. So this is actually the first book talk about the new book, which literally just came out from Island Press. I have my copy right here. And what the book is like the first edition. It covers every metro area that has rail transit or BRT, all mapped at the same scale with what networks they have, with population density, all fully described, all with photographs, all compared in terms of how effective those systems are, telling the story of which decision each of those metropolitan areas made and how that worked. And that's based on me having actually photographed and ridden and seen all of these systems. And in the new edition, we've added Canada. So it is now all of the United States plus all of Canada, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned from Canada. And also in the second edition, added a lot more content up front about how transit works and what makes successful transit. So when I did the book talks for the first edition, I really focused on the keys to successful transit, and all of that is still true, and all of that is still in the second edition. And in the first edition, I also had a lot of fun talking about what we're bad at when it comes to transit. What I said is we're not very good at this, pointing out maps like this that show transit systems, rail systems actually missing the population density that they ought to be serving. But I figured this time around, I'd take the opposite tack and actually talk about what we can do to make transit better. How can we create better transit so that people have access to everything they need in life? Because ultimately, this is about the riders, and this is about how do we make transit better for them. And throughout the book, in both the United States and Canada, there are some places which hold really good lessons to what is possible. So I'll talk about some of those things, and I think these apply to every place in the United States, and they definitely apply to the Bay Area. So the first is we need frequent networks. We need a lot more all day show up and go service, the kind where you do not need to look at a schedule, where you can simply go to a bus stop or a train station and know that train will be along shortly. This goes to a really important point. We need to speak a lot more about service. It's disappointing to see how much transit infrastructure we built in the United States without actually putting good service on that infrastructure. What matters is, will it actually be there for you? And in the book, I actually map all of these cities. And what this shows is the frequent transit footprint of all of those cities is the light bubbles here. And you can see how much of that population they actually miss. And what I was able to do in this book, thanks to the help of Remix, was actually run numbers on what portion of all of these metropolitan areas is within walking distance of frequent transit. And Vancouver, British Columbia is at the top of the list. 2/3 of the residents of Vancouver, BC metro area are within half a mile walk of a frequent bus or rail line. Of the metro areas in the book, the bottom of the pack is Little Rock at 0%. But what's interesting when you look at this is when you look at where the high performers are and where the middling performers are. And I will say the Bay Area does not look particularly good on this metric, 17%. It's notable that San Diego has twice the frequent network coverage that the Bay Area does. And I would argue that the land use in the Bay Area and the travel patterns in the Bay Area are actually much better suited to transit than San Diego is. Salt Lake City is beating the Bay Area in terms of frequent transit access. And this is part of the reason why Canada does well. One of the things that's extraordinary in the book is this graph, which shows transit ridership by metro area. And these metro areas are in order of population size. Now, New York at the top outperforms everybody else by far. That's not a surprise to us. But notice that all of the other bars that stick far beyond their peers are all of the Canadian cities. Canada simply has higher levels of transit ridership than the United States. And that's notable that that isn't land use patterns. You go to places like Calgary or Edmonton or even Ottawa, and you are not seeing particularly transit-friendly land use, but you are seeing really high levels of transit ridership. And a big part of that is simply they run a lot of service. Here is the frequent network footprint for Greater Toronto, for example, and look at how comprehensive that coverage is of the city of Toronto. There's basically no place in the city that isn't within walking distance of frequent transit service. And even when it looks at less frequent service, you see maps like this where you have cities which are essentially completely covered by transit, so that everybody there really has the option to use transit. And even where those routes are less than hourly, less than 15 minutes, they are connecting in to a larger, very comprehensive system. And frequency also means making better use of our infrastructure. The most frequent commuter rail line in North America, currently shut down to be expanded, is the Trillium line in Ottawa, 12-minute headways on commuter rail, and notably 12-minute headways on a single track commuter rail line. where those trains have to meet at sidings, and they actually manage to operate that day in and day out, making every bit of advantage of that infrastructure. And in expanding to Canada, frequency is no longer just limited to rail and buses. Canada actually has 2 different frequent ferry routes. Here's the Sea Bus in Vancouver. Every 15 minutes or better across the harbor, rail terminal at one end, a full bus interchange at the other, a ferry route that is running as an integral part of the transit system that you literally do not need to worry about a schedule to get on. Now, when we talk about this, we have to realize that means operations dollars. And I think one of the really important discussions we're having in the United States is, how do we actually fund transit operations? And should the federal government be part of funding those? Because we spend a lot of time talking about capital funding, but what really makes transit work is that day in and day out funding for operations. And if you look at the Bay Area, you can see some real gaps in the frequent transit network. Here's population density and frequent transit overlaid. San Francisco's doing well, but the East Bay, the southern East Bay, a place where a lot of people really need good transit, look at how little of that there is. Even in Oakland, you can see real gaps. And again, if you look down the peninsula, you can see very little frequent transit service. Another thing that almost every place would benefit from more of is dedicated lanes. We all know how bad it is to be on a bus or a train that is stuck in traffic. And this is something that we didn't focus on nearly enough. Here's a quote unquote BRT line in San Diego, where that brown line is the only bit of this where the bus is actually in its own lane outside of traffic congestion. But luckily, this is something we're getting better and better at. You have things like New York City converting entire streets into busways, and you have more and more people doing the gold standard of dedicated lanes, which is median lanes. And this matters because as long as your bus lane is a curb lane, you are always dealing with driveways, you are always dealing with turns. If you actually do a good median busway, it will be more reliable. And those are happening in all sorts of places now. San Diego has suburban BRT with dedicated bus lanes. You have places like Indianapolis making a massive investment, 7 miles of dedicated bus lanes on their first BRT line. You can see that's a real sizable segment. And they did that quickly, and they did that inexpensively, and they did that creatively. Here, for example, is a single lane, 2-way busway, where both northbound and southbound buses use that same straddle lane in the middle. They managed to fit it in the street. They work their schedules around it. You see smaller cities like Albuquerque, New Mexico, doing really good bus rapid transit with a lot of dedicated lanes. And you're also seeing larger cities like Montreal really see high quality BRT as a great way to feed into rail systems. I would say the Bay Area, San Francisco is probably doing some of the most ambitious amount of bus lanes anywhere and trying to get them done really quickly. And I'd say that in Oakland, outside of downtown Oakland, the Tempo BRT does a really good job in terms of the quality of dedicated lanes and stations. And that brings us to the next big point. We need to invest in really good transit that can form spines of our regional transit networks. We should be looking at the highest ridership bus routes, places like Vancouver, where you have a route where hundreds of people, thousands of people are being left behind having to wait for the next bus every day. And what Vancouver is doing is they are building SkyTrain. They are building an underground subway in their highest ridership bus corridor. More cities ought to be doing that and then taking advantage of that to really rethink their transit networks around it. This, for example, is Winnipeg BRT, a new BRT corridor serving as the impetus to convert the bus network around there from a series of infrequent radial lines into downtown to a series of feeder routes feeding into a high frequency BRT route in the middle. And what I'm starting to see is cities really focus their transit planning on putting more transit in the places where the highest ridership is. This is Austin's new transit plan passed by the voters in the middle of COVID, where you can see how the new lines they are building are really focused on where the jobs are and focused on where the people are, rather than focused on trying to get as far out into the suburbs as possible, and where those lines are also designed to really tie into the bus network. I'd say the best way for a lot of cities to do rail planning is simply take your highest ridership bus routes and turn them into rail corridors, and then take the next set and turn those into BRT. And I think that's a lesson the Bay Area could really learn. And along with that, build transit that serves many purposes. Transit shouldn't just be for work commutes. And I would argue that one of the best ways to measure the usefulness of a transit system is to see what kind of destinations it can get you to. The reason why New York's transit system is so great is you can essentially do everything that you need in your life on that transit system. And beyond the urban areas, I think we really need to focus on what we think of as suburbia. We need to expand that high quality transit beyond the pre-war urban cores. We all know transit works well in downtowns. We all know that transit works well in medical centers. We know it works well on university campuses. And I think we all have in our head the idea of what an old streetcar suburb looks like. But in a lot of places, the real density is things like 1970s garden apartments. And that's true in the Bay Area too. And especially if you look around the country, you can see that in a lot of cases, there's now a lot of low-income residents in those areas. Poverty is sprawling out beyond the old urban cores, and we need good transit there. And there's lots of ways to do that. You have Houston with a new bus rapid transit line through a 1970s suburban employment center. You have Toronto building out in a major way BRT in the suburban areas. And I'd really point to Vancouver. There's no city in the United States that has transformed itself around transit as much as Vancouver has. You follow the SkyTrain lines, and it's just clusters of new developments at every station. They are converting from single-story suburban sprawl to 20-story high-rises in one step. And that's not just at one station, that's around station after station. And it's really designed so you can live on transit. Here's a Safeway store integrated into a transit station, so you can literally grab your groceries as you get off the train. And like I said, you look at the Bay Area, that need is really there. We also need to do much better with intercity networks. Capital Corridor is a really nice example of this, but if you look across the United States, we're not doing a good job connecting cities to each other. There's some really nice examples. In Hartford, Connecticut, seamless fares between Amtrak and commuter rail between Massachusetts, Hartford, and New Haven. You've got some really good express bus services, which can begin to form that kind of thing. And you've also got some places like New Mexico that are doing a really good job of actually providing rural transit across the state. And we need to modernize. We really need to look at our existing, especially pre-war transit systems, and think about how can we make those work for today. Here you can see accessibility in Chicago CTA compared to New York City. Look how badly New York is doing there. And US systems have really lagged in adopting new technologies like open gangway trains, like automated operation. Frankly, I don't see why BART needs drivers. And if you didn't have a driver on every train, you wouldn't need to run a train every 20 minutes. You can see places like Toronto really focusing on regional rail frequency. They've acquired the tracks and they are going to run that service. And Toronto's also taken a pre-war streetcar system and has really started upgrading it with new vehicles, better stations, to really be a modern streetcar system that can carry lots of people reliably. And when I say that, you might think of something like Muni Metro, which could very much use that kind of upgrade. I'll point out Caltrain, though, is now one of the gold standards for what this is. Electrified frequent Caltrain will be a game changer. We need to create seamless connections. We need to think about bus and train networks together. And again, Toronto does an amazing job of this, the way that the Toronto subway stations become bus hubs. Here you can see a streetcar and a bus in underground stops inside the subway station. So you will not get wet making that transfer, and an entire bus network designed to feed into those rail lines. Even places like Salt Lake City are turning commuter rail stations into bus hubs. And of course, fares are a big part of this. We tried to diagram out in the book how American fare systems actually work, and just drawing this diagram gave me a headache. To make this better, we need to think about things like how we do governance, and we need to confront the political issues, often race, that underpin these. We can't let the suburbs be their own isolated places simply because they do not want the people from the city to come in. And we need to not get trapped in thinking about technology. And the Bay Area has some good examples. BART has some really nice bus feeder patterns in some places, but of course the fares aren't integrated. Of course, the passenger information isn't fully there. But I kept pointing to what Caltrain is doing. Caltrain is turning into a kind of BART. And I think the Bay Area ought to start thinking of Caltrain as a kind of BART, rather than saying, oh, that's FRA compliant technology, that's a different world. No, it's not a different world. We should think about the service and how it works together. And finally, we need to make transit easier to understand and use. I've seen some really nice efforts this way. Philadelphia just rolled out a prototype for how to rethink how their entire rail system functions, finally get rid of antiquated designations that date from private companies a century ago, and think about how to make this network across all modes and across multiple operators be presented as one seamless network. And I will say, sadly, the Bay Area is far behind in that Seamless Bay Area is the only map I can find that actually illustrates the entire Bay Area transit system as one system. I'd say the bottom line for everything I'm saying here is still what I said the first time around. We want to make good transit. We have to focus not on trains and buses, but on people. With that, I'm looking forward to the discussion. Definitely follow me on Twitter at Christof Spieler. My email address is there if you have any questions, and the book is at Island Press, and you can see the discount code right there.
Great, thank you so much, Christof. We'll leave that slide up for a little bit. Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed, reading through some of the new sections of the edition. I of course bought the first edition when it came out a couple of years ago, and this was, and as a native of Canada myself, I really appreciated the, having a lot of the observations that I had experienced. You kind of go into much more rigorous detail in kind of comparing some of those examples. So definitely encourage others to go out and take the time to look through the new content of the book, even if you did buy the first edition. So I have a couple questions here and that I developed, but if others who are attending want to drop any of their questions in the Q&A, I'll try to address a couple of those as well as they come in. So I want to talk a little bit about governance, because that's something that, of course, we look at a lot and discuss a lot. So there is a statement in the first edition of your book that is also in this edition of the book that I love, that you say, nothing, not physical geography, not population, not existing service, does as much to determine where transit is built as the invisible structure of governance and funding, the invisible structures of governance and funding. So with that said, I'm wondering, why don't you think we talk about it more as part of the solution? And maybe it seems like we talk about it a lot, but it feels like if this is so fundamental, it feels like, as an advocacy group, it feels like a very difficult thing to talk about and change. So I guess this is a two-part question. Should we be talking about governance more? And then among the different you profile a number of different, structures of governance, like city-run transit or state-run or special districts. Do you have any kind of overarching principles for what good governance or what optimal governance structures American regions should be putting into place?
So yeah, no, I mean, I think the reason we don't talk, I mean, first of all, it is invisible. I think people like talking about stuff they can see. I think part of the reason why so much transit discussion is about technology and infrastructure is that's the really visible part. Service is less visible, governance is even less visible. So I think that's part of the problem. I think another part of the problem is that often the people who are leading transit discussions are the people who are invested in the current system. You are not going to have transit agency heads really initiate discussions about changing the structure of transit agencies and merging transit agencies because they're the people whose jobs would be affected by doing that. And I think that's very human. And I think it's very human that agencies tend to think in terms of their current structure and their current role. Which is, I think, why advocates and elected officials have to lead that discussion. And that's true even for MPOs. MPOs are very much a creature of the jurisdictions that make them up. MPOs are not really the ones who are going to come up with the idea of how to bring everything together. I think there has to be some sort of political mandate to change this. And that means we actually have to talk about why governance matters. And I think the Bay Area is one of the most obvious places to talk about it because we can see how that governance affects the service. And the reality is people's lines cross these jurisdictions, like where people live and where people work and where they visit their friends crosses these lines all the time. And we can't as long as the transit reflects those lines, it's not going to work for people. For me, the bottom line for governance is always rider experience. We should always have this discussion in terms of what do you experience as a rider? And to me, it's you want one integrated system with good connection points, with good integrated schedules. You want one fare system. You want one unified passenger information system. How you provide that, there's a lot of options. I mean, there's obviously the one where one agency operates everything, and the best integrated transit systems in the United States are in places like Denver, where there's just one transit agency, and it turns out they can integrate with themselves. I'll note that that's not enough. New York City has one transit agency, and New York MTA does not manage to coordinate with itself. It not only separates commuter rail from subway, it has two separate commuter rail agencies that actually fight each other all the time. And they spend billions of dollars because their own agencies can't get along with themselves. So just having one agency is not going to solve it. On the converse, there are ways to make this work with multiple agencies. I mean, the best example I always point to is Germany, where you have the Verkehrsverbund, where you can have places that have dozens of different transit operators creating one seamless system. It is possible. But again, that requires that outside political mandate that basically says to them, you guys are going to work together and you do not have a choice about it. And then guess what? The agencies figure out how to do it, especially if there's a really clear vision on what they're supposed to do. So I'd say what the best governance system is intensely local. And in the Bay Area, the multiple counties, multiple cities, like the governance structure has to take that into account. And I would say that something like BART, for example, historically, you could see how BART was dominated by suburban interests that actually shortchanged Oakland and San Francisco. Like, that's not necessarily a good thing. Expanding the footprint of governance too far can actually get you in a situation where some of the areas that need transit the most get neglected. So I would say the bottom line is there's actually a lot of good governance models. They all need to have mechanisms for coordination. They all need to focus on really having the passenger experience first and foremost. And they also need clear accountability. I think the worst governance models are one where people don't know who's in charge. And one thing that I think, for example, works in San Francisco is people know the mayor runs Muni. Like there isn't a level of accountability there, and mayors can be held accountable if Muni doesn't work. People know who the BART directors are, and people know they vote for those BART directors, and that those directors are who they yell at. And I would say that, for example, if you look at Caltrain, one of the problems with the Caltrain governance structure that has been very obvious recently is nobody's really known who's run Caltrain, which means the people who make the decisions have in some ways been able to avoid accountability for those decisions, except for the intrepid bloggers who are pointing out what they're up to. So I think that accountability part is really important. But I would say the Bay Area needs to solve transit governance because what's on the ground today is not working. And I think the status quo is absolutely not the right answer.
Thank you. So, and a specific component of this that someone asked a question about, like, I guess there's network governance, but then, you know, there's the specific issue of consolidation. Someone asked, you know, in what situations does consolidation actually, you know, maybe is the right solution? And, you know, I also think, you know, you showed an image of, you know, Caltrain as a sort of, you know, it is becoming like BART, or it's increasingly becoming like BART. Is that an example? Like, do you have any thoughts about consolidation of, or any, like when it might be part of the governance solution?
Yeah, I think consolidation, I mean, you can think about where are logical boundaries, where are systems that you want to operate really closely together, where are there agencies that have very similar needs and very similar competencies. And, you know, for example, merging Muni and AC Transit by themselves would not have a whole lot of benefit because they don't really connect. I mean, they sort of connect, but they don't like there's very little benefit you would get from sticking those two agencies together. To me, the experience of getting off of a BART train in Millbrae and getting onto a Caltrain in Millbrae just gives you the proof of why those two agencies need to coordinate better. And I would argue that the kind of governance structure that BART has, which already covers multiple counties, which already has a regional focus, is very similar to what Caltrain needs. And the kind of service BART provides, the kind of issues they deal with are very similar to Caltrain's issues. And also, neither of them runs in a street. Like, there is a real advantage to Muni being part of an agency which operates the same streets that it runs in. That's not something that BART or Caltrain have to worry about. So I would say those are two agencies which have very similar needs. But again, you don't want to merge agencies and create new governance problems. Like, the solution is obviously not to have a BART whose directors are elected only by Alameda, Contra Costa, and San Francisco, running a system that's in San Mateo and San Jose. Like, to me, that would require expanding the governance structure so that all of the people who are served by that system have an equal voice in running that system.
Thank you. So there were a couple questions about land use, and I think the observation that you made about you know, several Canadian regions having much higher levels of transit use, even though they're much smaller in size and oftentimes don't have necessarily very transit supportive land uses in their suburban areas. You know, does that mean that land use doesn't matter? I guess is one of the direct questions, you know, or
No.
Is it, how do we square that with the idea that density is one of the fundamental things that you say is key to transit success?
Oh, land use absolutely matters. And if those Canadian cities provided the level of service that they do and had the expensive downtown parking that they do and the other factors that lead to high ridership there, but were twice as dense, they would also get much better ridership. To be clear, Montreal does better than Edmonton. Like their land use matters. It matters a lot. And I would say that in a lot of the United States, there's clearly places where land use is the thing holding back ridership. There are definitely places where we have really nice transit infrastructure running really good service that drops you off in utterly unwalkable places with no place to go. But I would say there's actually a huge number of places in the United States where the land use is actually quite transit friendly, but the transit isn't good enough. Again, I mean, that's even a huge chunk of San Francisco. I mean, Geary is the definition of what I just said. Geary is a place where the density and the walkability are there, and we've been relying on a slow and very unreliable bus route in mixed traffic to carry that. And I also think that's true in places like Hayward, that like there's real pockets of density there without the kind of frequent transit service that density really justifies. So ideally, you have really good land use and you have really good transit. In some places, we have good transit and bad land use. Let's fix the land use. In some places, we have good land use and bad transit. Let's fix the transit. Or better yet, let's fix both of them.
Okay, thanks. So one thing that, in doing this national and then North American kind of overview of all of these different systems, some trends seem to emerge or that are distinct to the United States, and maybe some slightly distinct things about the Canadian examples, and then all of that in comparison to some of the other international examples that you cite. This kind of, to me, suggests that there's a role that federal policy could play to help regions across the U.S. do better on some of these things. And while there's been discussion and very welcome, there's been discussion about a lot more transit funding coming from the federal government, with hopefully more to come. I haven't heard a lot of discussion about policy changes that the federal government could make that might help make U.S. investments in transit and regions kind of more effective with regard to the where transit is built, how it's built, who it's built for. So, do you have any thoughts on policy changes that would be very helpful at this moment in time with our probably the most transit friendly president we've had in a long time, that would be very helpful that you'd like to see?
Yeah, no, I think for one thing, it's amazing when you talk to transit agencies how much federal funding rules drive what transit agencies do. Like in terms of where transit agencies build capital projects, the availability of federal funding plays a huge role in that. There's some agencies which are rich enough to be able to fund their own projects, but most aren't. So whatever the feds will fund is what will get built locally. Whatever the feds make easy to do is what will get done. And to me, one of the best examples of that is the federal government actually makes it much easier to build big projects than small ones. If you want to take $100 million and build, one streetcar line, that actually, in a lot of ways, takes less process than if you want to take that money and build hundreds of bus stops scattered across your city. The bus stops will almost surely benefit more people. They're actually a simpler project. There's many fewer negative impacts. There's many more positives, but the sheer amount of paperwork it takes to do that. And so one of the things I've suggested is I wish the feds just had some really low overhead programs. Imagine if they just had a standard amount per bus stop, and every bus stop you upgraded with a shelter, they just wrote you a check. You didn't even have to give them the receipts. You just had to show them the finished bus stop and you got the check in the mail. Like that would really prioritize agencies to do things like that. obviously, this is also true for operations. If the feds smartly funded operations, and I don't think it makes sense just to have a, here's operation subsidy. I think that should be predicated on level of service. But if you had something like a federal program that funded frequent bus routes, that would cause agencies to do a lot more frequent bus routes. The other thing is the feds can put strings on their funding, and they've done that effectively in some ways. For example, the feds started over the last decade or two paying more attention to what level of service agencies are guaranteeing. So that they're saying, if you build this line, you actually have to run frequent service. That's a great thing. The feds have been focusing more on state of good repair. I'm very much in favor of that. But sort of, to me, like some of these governance things, some of these passenger information things, I would love it if the feds said, here's our minimum standard of passenger information. And if you do not provide it, you're not getting any funding from us. Here's the minimum amount of transparency we expect you to give the public about your operations. And if you do not do this, you're not getting any funding from us. And I would love it if the feds actually helped on that. Like, I would love it if every agency had to provide a good GTFS feed. I would also love it if the feds provided technical assistance to small agencies to help them do that. So actually, I think federal funding can be a really smart lever, and a bunch of this stuff doesn't have to be done through law. A bunch of this stuff can be done simply through rulemaking at the department level. And there are some really smart people who've gotten hired by the DOT since Biden gotten into office. I'm really looking forward to what they can do with that stuff.
Great, thanks. And then there's been several questions about equity. And you talk about that at several points in your book. How can the question here is, how can transit agencies address seamlessness, fair equity, and some of these other integration goals with equity, diversity, and inclusion lenses? And I'm curious specifically about who's in the room and how we set up. You talk about that a little bit, about who decision makers are in these processes.
Yeah, so I mean, I will say the one thing I added to the keys of good transit is I look back at the first book and realized I didn't talk about this enough, and talk about inclusion as one of the keys, that a good transit system is welcoming to everybody. And to do that requires a lot. Like, to me, one of the best examples is a lot of transit advocates across the country have been talking about proof of payment fare collection, which is a great way. It lets you board through every door, makes it easier for a rider. It makes transit faster. It makes transit more reliable. I love proof of payment. The problem is the people pushing for this, quite frankly, were a bunch of white people, and to whom fare enforcement and the fact that when you do proof of payment, you need some form of fare inspection on board was not a concern. You start talking to people of color, and you start seeing agencies put armed police officers on buses and trains to check for tickets, and suddenly proof of payment is legitimately scary to a significant portion of your riders. Like, it is tying into these long-time oppressive systems. And that doesn't mean we don't do proof of payment. It does mean we have to be really thoughtful in how we do it. And you won't think of stuff like that if you only listen to middle-aged white guys in running your transit system. I mean, I also mentioned stroller policies. It's amazing how badly transit agencies treat parents with children. And again, I think that's because not a whole lot of people who run transit agencies have to take care of children and have to get them on and off buses. So I think having transit leadership, transit boards who really reflect the people who ride those transit systems is going to make for better transit always. And in all of these discussions we make, like, equity shouldn't be a reason not to change things. It should be a reason to change things thoughtfully. And the way to do that is make sure people who understand the stuff are in the room. The other part of this is we actually have to be honest about these discussions. I wrote a piece for Kinder Institute. I encourage people to look up on race and transit. I mean, so much of the history of transit in the United States is a history of race. So much of the way we think about transit and run transit is based in the white backlash to the civil rights movement. It is based in that suburbanization. It is based in those governance structures. I mean, entire states reorganized themselves so that white people's kids didn't have to go to school with black people's kids. I mean, that is the state of Connecticut right there. And that ends up influencing transit in a lot of ways. The way the mental model of transit is a mental model of race in a very real way. And things like governance structure, like why doesn't MARTA cover all of Atlanta? It's because the white suburban counties do not want to be in the same transit system as the core city, which they perceive as black. And if we don't actually talk about this stuff, we're not going to overcome it. We actually have to talk about race when we talk about transit as a way of fixing in all of these things we have built in. I think the whole discussion about choice riders versus dependent riders is a cloaked way of talking about race, and we need to call that out. I think the way we think about buses compared to trains, like the question of why when we build a new train system, does every stop have a shelter when every bus stop doesn't? I think race is a big part of the reason for that. And we need to question these assumptions we make. Another one of my favorite examples is commuter rail systems tend to design so that everybody gets a seat. Local bus routes are designed so that half the people at rush hour are standing. It's actually easier to stand on a commuter rail train than it is to stand on a bus. The rides are much smoother. It's much easier to stand up. Like, why do we treat the two differently? And the answer is, we've designed commuter rail for middle-class white people who we value. And it's interesting that that model sticks even as the ridership has actually gotten more diverse. If you look at Caltrain ridership, if you look at BART ridership today, it's actually quite very diverse. But in a lot of ways, our thinking about it is still like, you know, Richard Nixon boarding the first BART train kind of thinking. And so I think we need to explicitly have these discussions.
Thank you. So at this point, I'm going to ask, we might have time for one or two more questions, but to make sure we have time, I want to ask our advocacy director, Adina Levin, to just quickly highlight a couple of pertinent advocacy opportunities, because many of the issues that you talked about are under active discussion here in the Bay Area. And I thank you for highlighting the role that advocates and riders play in bringing about change, and how some things have to come from riders and advocates, and that will never come from the agencies or the operators themselves. So, Adina?
Yeah, and there are some really exciting things where there's an opportunity to dive in and help make good things happen in the really near term. And so I'm sharing a screen so I can share a timeline. One of the key pieces of integration, having a seamless system, not the only one, but is having a seamless fare system. This is something that at Seamless Bay Area we've been advocating for quite a while, and helped kick off a study that is delivering results. And there's going to be some decisions made just in the next couple of months to help start the first couple of steps of integrated fares. In order to be able to get fully integrated fares, as well as integrated schedules and branding and wayfinding and so on, we're going to need to have those governance changes that Christof Spieler talked about, and we're going to need funding to implement. One question that somebody had is, say, do we underestimate the value of funding bus service? Absolutely, we underestimate the value of funding service in general, and in order to have a connected system, you need to have the service that connects together. That fare study that is coming forward is going to be including things like a transit pass, that instead of just being a VTA pass or a SamTrans pass, it will be, you can use that pass to go any place for someone in a college or a housing development or a workplace or a union. The other thing is they're going to be rolling out potentially as soon as 2023. It's free transfers. And then there are deeper levels of integrated fares that could be done with additional funding. And the timeline on that is it's going to be a whirlwind over the next month or so. And there's going to be meetings at all the different transit agency boards. Speaking of governance, the fact that in order to get a change, you need to go to 8 transit boards is not the way that it should be, but it is the way that it is. And one of our team members will put into the link a sign up to be coming to these meetings in September and October and supporting the seamless fares, and decisions to fund the pilots in those first stages are going to be made in October. So it is soon, and these are things that you can help with. And then in terms of bringing about the governance that is needed to make that happen, there are studies that are going to be in the works over the next 6 to 12 months with opportunities to really support that governance change to get us to an integrated system. And there are steps being taken toward a regional transit funding measure to get us to that level of service frequency and to pay for some of the fare integration and branding and the other good seamless service that we need. So this is definitely something that if you are here and you care and you're in the Bay Area, you definitely can help with. And please sign up with the link that is being shared, and we will reach out to you with things that you can do. Thanks. And I'll be happy to take any questions about that as we take the last questions in the last few minutes.
Dave can wrap us up with the information about Christof's book so we can finish off before 6, but then if people have time after that, we can maybe take 1 or 2 more questions for anyone who wants to stick around.
Sure thing, Ian, and thank you very much. And thank you, Adina, for the advocacy update. As you all know, we are very optimistic about the potential for the major progress in these areas coming up this fall. And we're thankful and grateful for all of you for joining us over this last hour in helping kind of gather the momentum, but also the awesome book that's coming out. As you know, Seamless Bay Area is a small but mighty organization that relies on contributions from our supporters to carry out this work. Thank you to everyone who has donated to us in the past, because your contributions have directly impacted and enabled the progress that we've been having so far. If you haven't contributed recently, and if you support this important work, we would like to encourage you to make a recurring or a one-time donation to Seamless to support our continued success and progress. Because we have Christof here, and we want to provide you with an extra incentive to donate. The next 5 people who make either a one-time contribution of $100 or a recurring donation of $10 a month will receive the signed copy of the 2nd edition of Christof's book, Trains, Buses, People, as our thank you. Also, you can visit seamlessbayarea.org/donate to make a contribution now. We would like to also offer those of you in attendance today to buy Christof's book through another means. We are dropping a special discount code into the chat that is exclusive to today's attendees, and can be used to buy the 2nd edition of Trains, Buses, and People at a 30% discount. A huge thank you to Christof and Island Press for offering this generous deal to our supporters. Thank you once again for coming to today's conversation. We encourage you to seek out other Transit Month activities between now and the end of the month, including the Ride Contest, but also our Writer First Awards taking place on October 1st. We are also hosting a game night in a happy hour in 2 days, which is Thursday, September 23rd. We would love for you to attend. We're going to drop that link into the chat now, but during the event, we plan on playing a round of the Bay Area's first ever seamless transit board game, Connect the Bay, and you will have a chance to connect with and chat with fellow transit fans and supporters from around the region. We hope to see you there. And for the full schedule of Transit Month events, please visit sftransitwriters.org/Transit Month. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending tonight's speech or speaker, as Christof. Have a wonderful evening and be safe out there. Good night.
Christof, are you able to stick around for
I'm happy to stick around a little more.
Okay, so yeah, thank you everyone who has to leave. And for those who want to stay for another few minutes, we'll try to take a couple more questions here. We'll be done by 6:10. Let's just keep it to that. COVID, we didn't talk about COVID at all. It's sort of an obligatory question at webinars. About any talk about transit. How has, your book, I think a lot of the ridership figures were pre-COVID. What's different? Do you have any further observations to make about how, even any recent information about how what we're seeing about people coming back to transit, how it reinforces things that you said in the book as important, or perhaps any new considerations that we need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's too early to know. Like, one of the things I have found highly frustrating from day one of COVID is the number of pundits who are absolutely sure they know what the future looks like, and somehow it always aligns with their ideological priors. I mean, we are still in COVID. I think people's day-to-day behavior, and I think the Delta variant has obviously made that very clear, but we are not out of the COVID world. So I think everything we know about transit ridership since last March is that, like, this is some weird in-between state. I will say that looking historically, I think things like this do not tend to change the world as radically as we think they will. I do not think the outcome of this will be that everybody works virtually. I do not think that the outcome of this is that people will move away from cities to the countryside because density kills people or anything like that. And I think we've already seen that. We've already seen the degree to which, as places have reopened, people have like sworn back to what they love doing, even at risk of their own health. But I think that COVID has shown us some truths that we may have ignored for a long time. I think one of them, for example, is just what a demanding job running transit is. I hope COVID has given people more sympathy for what it is like to be a bus operator. And that is, in fact, a very dangerous and very demanding job. And I hope the result of that is that we take the needs of bus operators a little more seriously. One of the best things we could do in the United States is provide restrooms at end of route layovers. Like, it's just really basic stuff. So I think that's one thing. I think another is the transit lines systems that have seen the greatest ridership drop from COVID are the ones that are single purpose transit, and especially the ones that are focused on 9-to-5 white collar jobs in a downtown area and getting people to and from those jobs. And in the first edition, long before COVID, I argued that we shouldn't design single purpose transit. I think that is abundantly shown here, that transit lines that carried a wide range of people for a wide variety of trips are the ones whose ridership has proven resilient, and these sort of very micro-targeted, especially long suburban white-collar commute-focused transit lines is where the ridership has dropped off. And I think that's a good lesson for us to learn as well, that we really shouldn't be designing lines like that. We should be designing lines that run all day and serve a wide variety of destinations and that are useful to a wide variety of people. I mean, and also I think it is hard to overstate how hard this period has been on transit agencies. It's obviously been hard on the operators. It's been hard on service planners who have been dealing with repeatedly redesigning systems around new parameters. And I really feel for anybody who's in a CEO position at a transit agency dealing with all of the uncertainty that transit agencies have had to deal with. And even with more operating money from the federal government, that the transit agencies, which depend significantly on fares for their operating budget, are planning for a future that they can't quite quantify. And a 10% drop in fare revenue will put a big hole in your budget if you've got 50% fare box recovery. And I think we should think about how we fund transit as a result of that. You know, that maybe it isn't a good thing that we were depending so much on fares to operate this transit. So we're going to be dealing with uncertainty for a while longer. But we should take this moment to question some of those long-held assumptions. We should take this moment to make change happen. Again, I love that Caltrain has been taking advantage of this and saying, you know, when we bring back service, we can rethink about what that service looks like when we bring it back. We can make something better. And I think we all need to be thinking about how do we come out of this better. What I think we definitely don't need to do is give in to the people who are somehow arguing that COVID shows that transit has no future, that COVID shows that transit isn't worthwhile. I think as transit advocates, we really have to be making the case that transit is as important as ever, that the basic geometry, the fact that 40 people on a bus take up way less space than 40 people in single occupant vehicles, that has not changed due to COVID. The fact that cities are the drivers of economies, that has not changed. And so the need for transit has not gotten any less. And obviously, as we've seen it, there's a whole lot of people who are dependent on transit for their everyday trips, especially people working service jobs who never stopped riding, who will always need that transit system, and we need to make their trips as good as possible.
Thanks. So the last question, and so we can wrap up by 6:10. We didn't really talk a bit at all, or you touched on it a little bit about fares in some of your responses, and that was, of course, one of the opportunities that is coming up here in the Bay Area with our region studying a number of different possible fare structures and assessing the relative, ridership and value and of different structures. And I would encourage everyone to read the section in Christof's book about this. Can you talk a bit about what are fares for? You kind of break it down in your book in a way that I hadn't really ever thought about it before. So I just love a summary of like, why do we even charge fares, and why do you support a unified fare system as something that you sort of highlighted in a couple places as an important a component principle?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is, in a large part, we charge fares because we've always charged fares. Like it's always amazing to me the degree to which discussions that transit agencies have about fares don't actually involve ever articulating why fares exist. It's clear that for some systems, fares are a big part of what funds the system, and that's true for BART. That's true for Caltrain. And so obviously, to some degree, they charge fares because if they stopped charging fares, there would be a huge hole in their budget. I think for other systems, fares are a way of making transit politically acceptable. There's a lot of people who sort of have this strong resistance to the idea of government handouts. And somehow the idea that people get to ride the bus for free offends some people. So I think that's part of why we charge fares. Mind you, those people don't tend to be offended by being allowed to drive down the freeway for free or by being allowed to park for free. So that's clearly not an ideologically consistent point of view, but I think that there's always been that kind of political aspect of fares. And then I think fares are also used as a way of controlling who rides, that fares can be a way of excluding people. I would argue that some of the reason why commuter rail has had higher fares than local buses in a lot of places is that that's actually intentionally being done so that the low income people are on the bus and not on the train. And again, nobody will ever articulate that, but I think if you look at the history, if you look at the politics behind it, I think that's a part of it. And amazingly, to some degree, I think fares exist to limit ridership. I mean, like when this discussion has come up of, should we do free fares? One of the takeaways across the board is if we do free fares, we have to provide more service. And especially you see that with systems doing higher peak fares than off-peak fares. You see that with systems like BART making short trips relatively expensive. Because that's a way of trying to keep capacity for the longer trips. Like fares, just like tolls, can be a way of managing demand on the system. So I would say, number one, when we have a fare discussion, we should talk about what we're trying to accomplish. Number two, I would say that fares should not be an impediment to fares should not make transit harder to use. And so in one way in which that's true is, I would argue that fares make transit harder to use through the mechanism of paying fares, sometimes more so than the cost itself. That old school way of, I want to ride a bus. The bus fare is $1.25, and I only have a 20 in my pocket. How am I going to ride that bus? Like literally the act of paying a fare can make things more complicated, which means we ought to think about how do fare systems make things easier. And I also think it just makes no sense for fares to be dependent on what mode you ride or what agency you're riding. Like, regardless of what your rationale is for charging fares, I think it should make sense that going from point A to point B should just cost a certain amount, regardless of whether you get on a bus or a train, regardless of whether you make a transfer or not. And that to me is the ideal fare system. It's not necessarily a flat fare. I mean, I'm not saying going from Santa Rosa to San Jose should cost the same as going, 10 blocks in San Francisco. But I don't know why going 10 blocks in San Francisco should cost differently if you take BART or Muni. I don't know why going from Hayward to Oakland should cost differently if you take BART or AC Transit. And I really don't know why we should charge people extra to transfer. I was just saying on Twitter, it's funny, if you think about it, airlines, if you look up airline fares, airlines charge you a premium for nonstop flights, and your flight actually costs less if you have to make a connection. Transit does the opposite. We say the people who have the least convenient trip have to pay the most, and the people who have the most convenient trip have to pay the least. That makes no sense. And it makes no sense to have fare systems be different for agencies which occupy the same geography. I mean, again, we're into governance discussions here, but I don't care how you solve the governance. It makes no sense. And simply having something like the Clipper card where everybody takes the same card, you're still being double charged. Yes, I made it a little easier, but I am still penalizing those transfers, and you end up having to duplicate service. The peninsula is a great example. There are two frequent transit routes on the peninsula, and in the future world, I will note, one is electrified Caltrain, one is El Camino Real. Literally, the two routes are immediately next to each other. The only two frequent things are literally competing parallel within blocks of each other for much of the corridor. If that was a seamless system, you could imagine turning the bus network by 90 degrees and having frequent bus routes that intersect Caltrain and actually have a system that works much better for everybody. And fares right now are the impediment to that, and they shouldn't be. If people are making trip decisions based on fares rather than making what the best connection is, you end up having to design a more complicated system for it.
Yeah, I think that parallel in the East Bay with BRT, I always think it's interesting that none of the BRT lines are going perpendicular to BART, feeding into the BART system. The one BRT line we built is going parallel to the BART.
And the other thing I have to say, like, this just shocked me. I loved Tempo when I wrote it. Like I said, it needs proper lanes in downtown Oakland, and it needs to go to Berkeley. I mean, the NIMBYs over there, we can go on about that. But If you look at the map on board the buses and at the stations, it doesn't tell you where the BART connections are. And in some, like the station names don't even make it clear that in fact, I can get off here and walk over to a BART train. Like that is so basic. Like which BART station in downtown Oakland do you get off to get on Tempo? Like you can't actually figure that out by looking at the Tempo map. Like that's ridiculous. It's great because the system is actually designed so there's multiple points where those transfers happen. And then we don't tell the passengers that those transfers exist.
Mm-hmm. All right, we'll wrap up. Thank you so much for spending so much time with us and staying a few extra minutes. And yeah, everyone should go out and check out Christof's book. And again, the code is webinar for use on the website, the Island Press website. And again, the first 5 people to make a $100 donation or a monthly recurring donation of $10 to Seamless Bay Area will get a signed copy of the book from Christof. So again,
that is a really good deal.
All right, and you'll support our advocacy while you're at it. So thanks again, everyone. Bye.